Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. In just a moment, you'll hear from my colleagues, Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallant. All three of us were out in the Penn State practice field in team facilities on Tuesday, and that's when Penn State wrapped up its preseason camp schedule. 3 weeks of arduous work out there on the field, trying to figure out where guys are going to find roles. We'll talk about that a little bit later here in the episode. We'll work our way through exploring the projected Penn State depth chart. If you follow Penn State football, you know the last few years the team hasn't put out any kind of public depth chart, but we put our minds together at Lions247.com and published one here on a Thursday morning. We're recording early afternoon Thursday, and without further ado, bringing in Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallant. Guys, we made it through another preseason camp. We got a few looks at the Nittany Lions. We'll get a much longer one on August 31st when they head down to Morgantown for a matchup against West Virginia. We will see another practice between now and then, but not only did we see practice on Tuesday, and about 20 minutes of it, we also heard from James Franklin, all three coordinators, a few veteran players. And so, Mark, we're going to do our best over the course of what I expect to be a pretty long episode here at the Lions 24/7 podcast to lay out, empty the notebook a little bit from what we learned, what we may not have learned quite yet during the course of preseason camp.
If you're saying it's going to be a long episode, I'm officially nervous. We're supposed to do something at like 3 o'clock, so I hope
just cancel that. This is going to be 3 hours.
No, I'm just kidding. Hey, the thing, I actually asked James Franklin, and sometimes I think we get caught up in the kind of the day-to-day of camp, and we forget to ask like the big picture, like where do you think you guys are? And I think he gave a very good answer in the sense that he likes where they are. He doesn't think they have any glaring areas that they haven't addressed. He started off early in preseason camp talking about the competitive balance between the offense and defense. And to him, that's something that's carried through. So, you know, I think they had a productive preseason camp. We're able to name their leaders finally. And I think we probably had a good idea of who some of them were going to be. I think maybe some surprises who weren't on that list, but I like where they're at. I mean, I'm just ready to get this season rolling because at this point, you know, I look at this team and I think it's set up for success, but I love the fact that they're opening against a challenging opponent on the road because we are going to learn so much. We are going to learn so much against West Virginia that I can't wait for that game to get here.
Yeah, we're just 9 days out from that matchup now. And Daniel, it's a Penn State team coming off a pair of 10-win seasons, one of which they capped off with the New Year's Six Bowl victory, and then they lost in that setting last year. But now with the expanded playoff and this class of 2022 that's been circled for a while now for the Nittany Lions, they're the upperclassmen. Denai Dennis-Sutton, the defensive end, one of the lead members of that group, a former five-star, said this week when we were talking with him after practice that they have now taken command of this team as upperclassmen, and they're demanding it of themselves to make this a college football playoff push. Now, we've heard that from other classes. You know, I remember P.J. Mustafa representing that 2018 class, talking about how important it was for them to go out in a final ride, get to the Big Ten championship game. We haven't seen the other classes be able to reach that. What do you make of this group, the 2022 class, kind of as the spearhead of it? Now that we're at a preseason camp, are you putting 2 feet on the bandwagon? Are you taking a foot off the bandwagon? What do you think about Penn State breaking through that seal, getting to the CFP right now? I'm not asking you for a prediction, but just kind of a vibe check.
Yeah, I mean, I think this class of 2022 is a good example of how transient college football can be and how quickly this stuff goes by. I mean, it's still kind of, you still want to default to guys like Drew Aller, Nick Singleton, and Abdul Carter to be like, oh yeah, the young talent on this team, when if everything goes right for a bunch of these guys, they won't be around next year. They'll be on NFL rosters. So you know, this stuff comes and goes pretty quickly. But I mean, I think it's a good group to get behind. I think that you look at where members of this class are and the positions that they play and the roles that they'll occupy. You got the quarterback, you got the running back, you got 2 defensive ends, you got a safety in KJ Winston, who's a team captain. I think that this is the group that really sets the tone, and everything will go from there pretty much. If these players can really reach that potential that the recruiting rankings had them at and that we saw teased over these past 2 years, I think you're looking at a team with a really high ceiling. So I still feel good about this team. And especially this group. I know that we'll get into predictions a little bit more next week with where we have things, but I think that I feel comfortable with them. I think that these are guys that have seen a lot We've seen a lot from them. We've talked to them a lot and learned a lot from them. And I think that they have Penn State in good shape where we stand right now, 9 days out.
Tyler, one thing that if I could mention, in a different era, these guys would all be redshirt sophomores. I mean, think about that. I mean, but all of the guys that Daniel mentioned came in and played immediately. And not only did they play, they were impact players. But I go back, I always reference that 1991 class, which was a great class with Kajana Carter and Jeff Hardings and Bobby Ingram. The vast majority of those guys actually redshirted. And by this point of their career, they were only redshirt sophomores. So that speaks to Daniel's point about the transient kind of nature. And I think it's not only important that these guys are third-year players, but they have played so much football and they have been in leadership roles. Drew Aller wasn't named the captain until this year, but I mean, just naturally, he was a leader of the team last year. Abdul Carter, I mean, not the most vocal guy, but when they were in a tough game, you knew that guy was one of the leaders. And the same thing with Katron and Singleton. I mean, both of those guys. So I think that's the thing that people are looking at and is really resonating, and why people are thinking, hey, number 8 team, projecting them to be in the playoff.
Yeah, and you want to talk about why we make the cases for this as a special group, aside from the fact that they brought in 3 5-stars, composite 5-stars that class. That was the first for the program with Nick Singleton, Drew Aller, and Denai Dennis Sutton. But you think about the impact they made right away. There was the starters that showed up, and some of them did it early, like the running backs. Some of them did it later, like Drew Shelton when he had to step up. But you think about, they were sandwiched between these two classes. 2021, which was a really interesting recruiting class generally because it was coming out of COVID. It was very much feeling the ramifications of the pandemic. And you only had 2 guys burn their red shirt that year. Kalen King was the headliner, but only 2 guys. And then the next year, 10 burn red shirt in 2022. You've got 4 of them playing 300-plus snaps in Abdul Carter, Drew Shelton, and then Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. Then you follow that last year. It's a 5-man burn redshirt class. They're all on defense, and no one plays 150 snaps in that freshman class last year. And we know rosters are structured differently. Maybe there's different opportunities for the depth chart, but just compare those 3 classes that have helped build this roster and look at the influence that the 2022 class has made. It's very notable. And 2 of those guys represented on this list of captains, which came out over the weekend. We'll address that now. Quarterback Drew Aller and safety KJ Winston were named captains as juniors. And then you've got more veteran guys, Nick Dawkins, a 5th-year senior, Dom DeLuca, a redshirt junior, Kobe King, another redshirt junior, and then punter Riley Thompson, who's been in the college game now for 3 years. And so when you kind of review that group of captains, Mark, you've seen a lot of different versions of Penn State captains rolled out over the decades. What's your initial reaction to this one?
It's so much different now because they used to have 1 or 2 captains, and now that they kind of spread the wealth, I don't know that there's one person in there that you think of as like the PJ Mustapher, rah-rah, or, people probably laugh at me. But Sean Clifford, I think, was a really good leader for this team in terms of being vocal and that sort of thing. But I think, generally speaking, it's not necessarily a bad thing because I think you can have kind of across the board leadership, and I think that's what they're kind of shooting for. 2 guys I wanted to mention. Number 1, Drew Aller. Clearly, James Franklin, I was getting the sense that he wasn't really happy with the way some people have maybe portrayed Drew, in the way that he said that, everybody voted for him. It was the team, the staff. Well, that's the same thing with everybody, right? Isn't it? I mean, that's how all the captains were picked. And for James to go out and out of his way and say that, I thought was pretty interesting. The other
Mark,
guy I want to touch on,
the phrase he punctuated that comment was total respect from within the program. Is total respect was what he tried to emphasize there.
Yeah, and I just loaded a video with that last night, and you can see it actually on our site on the front page where I think I was reading that to mean that he was thinking that maybe some people didn't have total respect outside of the program for him. So I don't know what was going on there. But the other guy, Kobe King, I think we knew since last year, after that bowl game, the way he came in and kind of took ownership, and you just had a feel that he was going to be kind of that guy. And you look at that Mike linebacker position, and I just look at that guy, he's always had those leadership qualities, extremely well-spoken, intelligent, really good football player, and he's at that natural position. So both of those guys, I think you have strong leadership. at the two natural positions on offense and defense. And to me, that's the most important thing. That's no disrespect to all the other guys who are named captain, but I think it's when your quarterback is a captain, I think that's an important thing for the offense. Same thing with your Mike linebacker. And they didn't just name them. I think those guys are natural leaders for people who have been around Drew, since he's been a freshman. Well, even before that. I mean, you guys talked to him when he was a recruit, and just the way he's carried himself. He just carries himself like a leader of young guys. So I think having those two positions is really key.
I think what we may have wondered with Drew is, could he be confrontational as a leader? And I think that's a necessary component, is to get in guys' faces sometimes over the course of a year, when you kind of have to redirect players or kind of get everybody in line for one reason or another. And it sounds like Drew has been a lot, I guess, evolved in that regard. And we'll see what it looks like on the field. I think that's what we're all curious about. It's great to hear the anecdotes from the practices, but I want to go back really quick to December 2020. Terry Smith, who's not just the cornerbacks coach here for Penn State, but he's also the defensive recruiting coordinator. Back then, speaking about Kobe King, he said, quote, "Kobe is the type of kid that will come here and be a future captain for us."
Right.
Sometimes you just know very early when a guy's like that.
And that was signing day, right?
That was signing day. Yeah, that was when him and his brother signed out of Cass Tech in Detroit. And then another guy I want to get to here is he's been on the podcast during high school. He talked about how important it was for him to be a leader and a facilitator for that class of 2020, which, again, that group faced a lot of hardships early because of the COVID situation and making their transition to college. But that's Nick Dawkins. I mean, this guy has been a tremendous vocal piece for that class for a long time. Over the years, because of depth competition and because of an injury that cost him much of the 2022 campaign, he hasn't been able to take that next step forward in terms of a presence on the field. That happened a bit last year. He was the primary backup at center, got almost 200 snaps, and it's happened in a huge way this year. I mean, whether it's on the record, off the record, everything we've heard about Nick Dawkins is just that he was built to lead men. He was built to lead a group. I think a great term that we heard from Caden Wallace when he was on this podcast last year, when his career came to an end, he called Nick Dawkins the ultimate gatherer of men. And so Nick can go in a lot of different paths when he finishes football, but I think he'll always be in a leadership type of position. And so to not just hear that it came together for him as a captain, but also as a guy who's solidly in place as a starting center. And we'll talk about what we think the offensive line is going to look like in the depth chart conversation later. But I wanted to really give mention to Nick Dawkins, because he was being considered as the team captain as a non-starter last year. And I've really never heard that. And so here he is as a starter, as a captain. And to me, when it comes push to shove and they go into halftime and it's a game where they don't feel good about the way they're playing, they may be losing on the scoreboard at that point, I don't know if it's necessarily going to be Drew Aller who steps up and says what needs to be said in that locker room. I think that it could very well be Nick Dawkins, and I think that's okay. I don't think it has to be your quarterback. I think he's part of that conversation. But when everybody in the room, all 105 guys, regardless of position or defense, offense orientation, are looking for a voice and a commanding presence, I have a feeling that that guy could be Nick Dawkins this year, if you're looking for kind of the pinnacle of this captain group. But I don't want to shortchange the others. Daniel, do you have anything to add? We have to acknowledge Don DeLuca's story is just fantastic, going from a walk-on who came to campus after a serious knee injury in a state championship game. A lot of us figured he'd be an afterthought or maybe a special teams piece, looking like he's going to be a starting linebacker, and he's a two-time team captain as a redshirt junior. So I wanted to make sure we also hammer that home, how impressive his journey has been.
Yeah, DeLuca really stands out to me, and he'll have that number 0 jersey again as that top special teams player, following in the Jonathan Sutherland footsteps there. But I think Riley Thompson stands out too as a team captain, someone who came in last year and I assume didn't really know how long he was going to be here based on the twists and turns of his eligibility saga there. We know he'll be here this year and next year. So for him to come in and have that role and make an impact in with the specialists, I think that stands out to me a little bit. And then KJ Winston, I think back to what we were hearing from KJ Winston on Zoom last year during the week when we talked to him during game weeks. And there's one availability where he talked about how he made it a point to know every single person's name in the program, that he wanted to be able to interact with everyone in the program, no matter what side of the ball they were on. or what their role in the program was. And to hear that from a sophomore, obviously we didn't get a chance to talk to him as a freshman and kind of get the day by day how his adjustment was going to Penn State. But to hear that from a sophomore, especially when he was in a room with guys who had played like Keaton Ellis, like Jalen Reed, some older players, for him to have that approach and be vocal about that, I think it really stood out to me. And then I've talked about it where the role that Penn State put him in down at the Peach Bowl and how he handled himself before the game and then after the game at the podium, I think that really stood out to me. So I've really enjoyed talking to him. I think that he's someone who really gives you a lot of honesty and insight and is just a very pleasant person to interact with. And you can see how he's someone where players can gravitate towards him and he can really do a good job of leading them. Like Mark said, I think that you look at quarterback, middle linebacker, those are probably the easiest positions to lead from. I think it's kind of like the closer you get to the ball, the easier it is. But I still think we've seen Penn State have captains at safety in the past. Keaton Ellis was it last year, Jaquan Brisker, Jair Brown, and now KJ Winston is in that lineage behind them.
I'm glad you keep referencing what we saw down in Atlanta because it was an adverse kind of situation in post game. There was some distrust, I would probably say, maybe between the media and the program or the players in the locker room because of the opt-out situations, because of the way the game went. It kind of got away from them. And so it wasn't the easiest situation to navigate for anybody. And James Franklin kind of gathered a couple, I think it was Tyler Warren and KJ Winston, right at the main podium. And you knew from that point, yeah, KJ Winston's going to be in a good spot to be a leader. And I'll just pass along something that defensive coordinator Tom Allen told us this week. He said he noticed from afar last year while they were on the field playing Penn State and Indiana. He said before the game, just watching KJ Winston go about his preparation is actually something that stuck out to him. And now that he's gotten to know him, he said, quote, "It's constant. He's so hard on himself. He's such a perfectionist in everything, sometimes to a fault. Sometimes you have to help him not dwell on a mistake and flush it. And at the same time, he elevates everybody around him. To me, that's what great leaders do. That's what great players do. So yeah, there's your group of captains. Well, we've been wondering what that six might look like. I think there's plenty of other names: Devon J. Thomas, Tyler Warren. It's a longer list than that, but it feels like a really strong Jalen Reed. It feels like there's a strong kind of a communal leadership in place here where, again, there's been years where it felt like it had to be one or two guys setting the tone. Maybe a bit different now, but it seems like the leadership is in place. Of course, you never know until you start to hit that adversity in season and how guys stick together. Daniel, I want to get to the touchdown and takeaways king because that's what we get at the end of preseason camp. Fortunately, Penn State puts that into the public sector and tells us what's going on in terms of who plucked the most interceptions or fumbles and then who reached the end zone most. Talk us through those results. You had the story up on Wednesday night at Lions247.com.
One of the touchdown kings, no surprise, quarterback Drew Aller. I think that is something that you expect to hear from your starting quarterback going through camp. The other one on the offensive side of the ball for touchdown king was Luke Reynolds, the freshman that we've heard a lot about over these past couple of weeks and seems to be putting himself in a position to contribute as a freshman. James Franklin said he's going to play. He doesn't know if it's going to be 4 games or 4 games plus postseason, which could still be a lot of experience depending on how that goes for the freshman. But I think it's clear this is kind of the evidence that Luke Reynolds came in, changed his body. He's put on about 25 to 30 pounds. According to his teammates, that's muscle. And it seems like that he's able to play with that and that it hasn't sapped him of any of his athleticism or anything like that. And then on top of that, we've heard that he's not afraid to get physical, which is something where you're making that transition from high school wide receiver or high school quarterback in his case to tight end. That's pretty different when it comes to playing the position. So to hear that Luke Reynolds has taken that approach and to see evidence of that as a touchdown king, I think that stands out and something to track as we go into the season with such a deep room. On the other side of the ball, Zakee Wheatley has his crown back as the takeaway king. I didn't get a chance to go all the way back to see how many times he's won it, but this is at least his 3rd time. I forget how many or if he won it last year. And then I
want to say he had it spring 2023 and preseason camp 2022. That's what I think it was.
I think he also had it spring 2022.
Okay.
Yeah, but either way, he's someone that we've heard a ton about his ball skills, and even beyond that, just kind of his knack for being around the play. He shared that with Cam Miller, the cornerback, and then safeties Colin Dinkins and Dewan Lane. Miller is someone that we're expecting to see a ton of this year as potential outside starting cornerback, and then potentially in the slot or at that lion spot in extra defensive back sets or in clear passing situations. Dinkins is someone that is in the mix to be behind Jalen Reed at that lion spot. It seems like he's really made an impression, the former run-on, with the coaching staff, and I think he made an impression on us with how he played in the blue-white game on Team Blue going up against Penn State's ostensible starters. And then Lane is someone else who, when you get these summer enrollees, it's wait and see. When are they going to show up? When do you think that they'll start to pop? It's different for everyone. We've seen Penn State summer enrollees make big impacts in the past, and Lane, it seems like, has done a good job of that. I got good feedback from him from Justin Lustig as someone who's really embraced special teams, and it seems like that's carried over to the defensive side of the ball on the practice field too.
I checked back to last August results for these awards. Just curious. Drew Aller and Keandre Lambert-Smith were the touchdown kings on offense, and then the takeaway kings on defense were Daquan Hardy and, at the time, freshman Tony Rojas. And we'll have more on Rojas a little bit later. We'll talk about that linebacker room. But I wanted to get into the receiver spot because this is an area where on back-to-back trips to Penn State facilities now, James Franklin has really gone out of his way, fellas, to talk about how both Liam Clifford and Harrison Wallace have separated themselves essentially from the pack, and not to say that other guys aren't going to play a bunch, but the consistency has been something that he harped on last Tuesday. He brought it up again this Tuesday. We talked to Harrison Wallace a bit. This time around, though, James Franklin did bring in a couple other names that he had to tip the cap toward, which is always good for us as reporters. He mentioned Julian Fleming and Omari Evans. Of course, Fleming making the move as an Ohio State transfer after starting 20 games with the Buckeyes. And then Omari Evans, very promising start to his career as a freshman, burn redshirt. Last year was one of the odysseys of that offensive season for 2023 and how Omari Evans was used or wasn't used. And he's kind of at a reset now as a redshirt sophomore. So, Mark, what do you make of what we've heard about the receiver spot? I want to note that we've also heard quite a bit of good things about Caden Saunders over the course of camp, but I believe he's been unavailable for the last little while. We'll be monitoring his availability on Tuesday when we get on the practice field, but it feels like they've got 4 or 5, and then you tack on maybe Tysier Denmark on the fringe there of guys that they feel like they're going to roll with as things get started.
Yeah, but I look at this and I look at Harrison Wallace as really their only proven commodity. I mean, he's the one guy that I wouldn't consider to be a breakout type of player. If you, sorry,
you'd save this for next week when we discuss our picks for such breakouts. But
in all seriousness, even though we didn't see, even though Trey Wallace was bumped up for a lot of last season, I think we've heard enough from people who we respect about what level of receiver this kid is when he's healthy. So I do think, from that, all joking aside, I think he's the only guy in this whole room that you could really look at as any sort of proven commodity. I think Fleming would be right there. But again, I mean, he's had that injury bug that he's not been able to get away from. So hopefully he's healthy. But the rest of them, I don't want to foreshadow where we're going to go when we're talking about question marks on this team, but it's going to be another instance where some kids are going to have to step up and prove themselves. Liam Clifford was a guy who was basically listed as a starter for nearly every game last year, only started one game. He's played a lot of football. Obviously, James has talked about him. The coaching staff has talked about him a lot this preseason, so he's obviously played well, but we haven't seen it consistently in games. And Omari Evans, again, we've seen flashes from Omari. We've seen big plays from him. He was probably one of the guys who benefited the most from the late season offensive coordinator change last year when they finally decided to start getting the ball in the hands of some of the. All right, am I back?
You're back.
Yep. Sorry, it just said that I was muted, which is probably just as well. But again, going back to it, Trey Wallace really is the only proven commodity. And whatever these guys did in camp, now it's time to see it. Everywhere else, I think they have guys who have done it in actual games consistently. This is the one spot on offense where we're really going to have to pay attention. Not that we're not paying attention to everything, but in that West Virginia game, I'm really anxious to see who besides Trey Wallace really steps up.
Daniel, I don't know how you would kind of gauge what we've heard about the receiver room, but it feels like for a while now, even going back to some of the workouts earlier this year, that Liam Clifford was emerging there, and that we knew if Harrison Wallace was going to be available this year, he was going to be viewed as wide receiver one. And to this point, he's been very available. He's been showcasing his skills on the practice field. But with Julian Fleming, I think people were cautious to talk too much about him. I also think he was getting up to speed in a new surrounding. I think that applied to this preseason camp. Have heard a lot more encouraging feedback on Fleming during the second half of preseason camp, the second half of August here, than we maybe did during the early days or even during spring ball. I think that's good. Again, he's getting through preseason camp. And I hate to say this, I'll knock on wood for Julian, the healthiest he's been on a college campus at this point in a calendar year. That's a significant deal for him and for Penn State. Omari Evans might be the one. The more I thought about this morning, the wide receiver discussion, he might be the guy who can be an X factor because we know he has game-breaking speed. He's had moments, but it just haven't been strung together. When you think about Andy Kotelnicki and just trying to take advantage of space on the field and a guy who can exploit that, I know we've mentioned Caden Saunders for that kind of role, but Omari Evans, for where he seems to be in this depth chart standing right now, he's going to have every opportunity to go assert himself as a force for this offense. Not a number one guy, but someone that defenses are really going to have to be backpedaling when they deal with him.
To go through these three guys that you just mentioned, I think starting with Liam Clifford, he's been the recipient of the treatment that we've seen James Franklin give a lot of players, where if a player at one position gets asked about, Franklin will attach a second player to that. We've seen it a lot with Drew Aller and Beau Fabula when talking about the quarterbacks, along the running backs. It's always Nick and Katron, and Clifford has been getting that treatment with Trey Wallace this spring, and you kind of wonder why, and we haven't seen enough to really know how deserving that is in terms of on field, but to hear it from Franklin, I think means that it's to some degree warranted, and Wallace gave him a pretty good endorsement to you, Tyler, earlier this week when he said that Liam has snapped this spring or this fall. That means that he's broken out, playing well, showing up, and I think that's
translating for us. I like it.
I'm too old now for that, but I thought that was interesting and a good endorsement. But I think the Clifford buzz at this point feels pretty real and pretty tangible with so much of this stuff. I mean, we didn't see a single 11-on-11 rep this month, and so a lot of this stuff is going to be answered at West Virginia. But I think that the Clifford feedback is really interesting to me. With Fleming, this spring and through the summer, it was more about the off-field stuff and in the wide receiver room and setting the tone that way with how he handles himself, how he goes about his business, which I think that this room probably needed. They probably needed someone with his experience and I guess gravitas to come in and maybe reset things a little bit, but there still wasn't too much feedback from Fleming on the field, and that's changed a little bit. Andy Kotelnicki said that Fleming has been a lot more consistent over the back half of training camp. Kotelnicki framed it as there were probably times in the first half of camp where Fleming would say, that's a play I want back, that's something I want to do differently, and that's not happening as much here. So I think that's a pretty promising sign in terms of what you can get out of Fleming. And then Omari Evans, I agree with you, Tyler, that he's someone who can really be a potential X factor. He ran the 40 over the summer or the spring at 4.31. We knew that he had that kind of speed coming in, but to really get that number in the testing environment, I think kind of makes it clear that the type of weapon that he could be for Penn State. I asked him at the beginning of the month, what happened last year, and he said that didn't give too many details, but said that it was a learning experience from him, and there's a lot of stuff he took away that he needs to improve and get better at. Trey Wallace said that Evans has come into this year and is trying to do everything he can so that he doesn't end up in a situation like he did last year, and he doesn't want to give the coaches the excuse or the reasons to leave him on the bench. So it seems like he's really motivated. He's someone that I really liked watching him play as a freshman. I thought that his profile as being new to the wide receiver position as a high school quarterback in Texas, but still having that skill set, I thought really made him a unique blank slate for Taylor Stubblefield and then Marcus Hagans to really work with. And I think that if he can click, if he can give them that vertical element, if he can do some things side to side, like we've talked about with Caden Saunders, I think that could be really interesting for this offense because that speed plays. 4.31 is no joke. And if you can get that onto the field and into space, Omari Evans could make some things happen.
And Andy Kotelnicki has a way of making it sound pretty simple, right? He said, if you have an elite speed guy, put him in a position to use his elite speed. And that's basically what we heard from, I think, from James Franklin, and maybe different words were used, but coming out of that Michigan State matchup last year on Black Friday in Detroit, Omari Evans had a big long catch right to the goal line. And James Franklin was like, we know he has this trait. Maybe we haven't been, focused on accentuating it enough over his sophomore year. And so, yeah, we'll find out. We'll have a little more conversation on these receivers in our depth chart piece a little bit later here. But let's go over to running back because James Franklin shed some very good light on this for us, what's going on behind Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. We know those guys, as long as they're available, they're locked in as leaders of that running back room. We also know that if things go according to plan, they're probably going to be wearing NFL uniforms next year. So when we talk about the number 3 running back job, it's significant right now because of your offensive plan, but we're talking about a player who may be able to surge himself and maybe be a projected starter when this team gets back on the field next spring. And right now, Cam Wallace, the redshirt freshman, carries the edge for that 3rd running back job. James Franklin wasn't ready to shut it down and say, and it's final, and he is RB3. He also mentioned that Corey Smith, who got to campus in June, has emerged under consideration for that job, along with fellow freshman Quentin Martin, a January enrollee. But he did say that Cam Wallace has put himself in a spot to be that guy going into West Virginia game week. We know that there were some bumps and bruises in play, not just with Cam Wallace, but with Quentin Martin. And so a little tougher to gauge last week. Now we have some clarity there. And Mark, again, all due respect to Trey Potts, who did everything that he was asked of last year in that RB3 role, coming in as a senior transfer from Minnesota. I've been saying for a while, whoever lands that RB3 job is going to add more juice to the offense versus what they had there last year. And Tony Rojas gave me a pretty good scouting report coming off the practice field on Tuesday about Cam Wallace. He says that he has the burst. That's always been a part of it. But there's a versatility to him like Nick Singleton. He said he doesn't have Nick's size yet. I think Nick Singleton's probably still about 15, 20 pounds heavier than him. But he said he has this blend of being able to take on the contact and keep moving through it, but also just straight up make you miss in the open field. He said he has been one of the most difficult matchups all preseason camp. When they go to one-on-one work, offense versus defense, you have a certain amount of space. Someone's going to win that. He said Cam Wallace has been really, really tough to deal with in that setting. So what do you think about his emergence here in year 2? He's a guy who, kind of like Omari Evans, didn't have a home at this current position in high school. He was playing quarterback. A lot of teams thought he could maybe be a defensive back or a slot receiver at the Power 5 level. Now here he is, maybe being that next man up behind a very talented duo.
Well, he's been in an ideal situation this whole year. I mean, remember, he was banged up last year. He didn't get into what exactly the issue was, but it really limited what he could do. And he talked about how difficult it was to kind of sit on the sideline and watch for the first time in his career. But fast forward to the spring. We know what James Franklin does, and it's very smart to do this. When you have proven commodities like Nick Singleton and Katron Allen, you don't give them a lot of work in the spring. And I think that opened up the opportunity, especially for a guy like Cam Wallace, to get out there and get a lot of snaps with the ones and do a lot of good things. From what we're hearing, one program source said he picked up in fall camp right where he was in the spring. And one of the stuff that we were told, he's learning how to control his balance, staying off the ground, not running on his toes, and just maybe sinking his hips. This is like, that's not running back 101. This is a guy who already has the fundamentals down, and now they're teaching him to take it to the next level. And I think that's just so important. And then to be in that RB3 role this year behind those 2 proven commodities, knock on wood, let's hope both of those guys stay healthy. And I say that for all players. I'm not being a homer. I want all players for all teams to stay healthy. But let's hope that they stay healthy. But if somebody gets banged up, now you have a guy who played all those reps, who did all that stuff in the spring, and who is getting to that next level in terms of absorbing the finer points of what it means to be a running back. But to be able to spend 2 years learning behind those guys, and let's assume that they both do head to the NFL, I think they're going to be in a really good spot with Cam Wallace and with the other kids they have, with Martin and Smith moving forward. Not to mention kids who are coming into the program. So Jaywan Sider has done a great job in that running back room, and I think being able to set up this kid to be RB3. And, let's see what Martin's able to do if they need him. We've heard all about his versatility and, the things that he can do as a kind of do it all Reggie Bush type of running back, not Reggie Bush.
Hey, and then, all Sider said was Marshall Faulk. So, I mean,
there you go. So but that's my point, is that you have different kinds of running backs there as well, who I think can really complement the big two. So I think they're in a really good spot. And I think Cam Wallace, I know, he clearly differentiated himself a little bit in the spring and then in camp.
Yeah, he's looking to make his college football debut next Saturday when this team visits West Virginia. We'll see what it means for Quentin Martin and Corey Smith. James Franklin did mention something interesting, essentially treating those freshmen as like one player and trying to maximize 8 game appearances for them in the regular season. You get one guy to 4 games, the other to 4 games, and they maintain that red shirt. And then in the postseason, James has been very quick to mention this when talking about eligibility. Then in the postseason, all bets are off, and maybe you can spring some guys loose in those matchups. But we'll keep tabs on the running back position. Again, we don't expect to see a ton of third running back involvement, but when they do, guys like Cam Wallace, Quentin Martin are worth keeping tabs on because what they bring to this field. There was a bit of a discussion about the green light. In fact, you asked about this to James. He wasn't ready to go down that road yet because he still had conversations. There was conversations Tuesday night into Wednesday with members of that freshman class. And you're either saying, hey, you got a green light, join us on the varsity field next week because we got to get ready for West Virginia and you're going to be involved. Or you're saying, hey, you're a scout teamer right now. Try to get on that travel roster so you can come and join us and be on the sideline. But right now we need you to take on the role of a West Virginia player and help our offense or help our defense get ready. And Daniel, it's always a bit of a rocky road for some of those freshmen to have to digest what their first year might look like on campus. But we haven't gotten the green light list. I think that maybe that will come for us this upcoming week. We understand James wants to take care of those matters privately before he goes public with it. But what do you think ultimately about the impact of this freshman class? We talked so much about what they did in 2022. Last year, you almost got nothing on offense. I think Andrew Rapplier played the most out of any offensive freshman, and it was like fewer than 40 snaps. When you project it, do you see scattered impact across both sides, or do you think it's more of a repeat and this will be a team that leans on known commodities?
The redshirt discussion is going to be interesting, and I thought that Franklin's framing of using Quentin Martin and Corey Smith as one person kind of and approaching it like that, I thought that was a really unique way of framing it that I haven't really thought about. But across college football, I mean, it's going to be interesting for these teams that are in the mix for the playoff, because if you max out, you could play 17 games this year. And if you do that, someone could play in 9 games, the 4 regular season and 5 postseason, and still retain their red shirt. So someone could still play in more than half of a team's games and still be a red shirt, which is kind of crazy to think about when you start going through all the different combinations and permutations of the season. But I think Penn State is going to pick its spots. I do think that we'll see with Quentin Martin and Corey Smith if they do enter into that green light conversation. Luke Reynolds is someone where I'm really curious what that looks like. Of course, health is something that is tough to factor in right now because you don't want to predict an injury for anyone, but that's something that can change the calculus like it did for a Drew Shelton 2 years ago. That can force someone to need to be ready. But I think that we'll see a decent number of these freshmen this year. I think that there will be good opportunities for them. And I think that there's pretty good excitement around guys. I think that seeing DeJuan Lane mentioned as the takeaway king, and getting the feedback from Justin Lustig that he's someone who's really embraced special teams. That's usually where you see those young defensive backs burn that red shirt. I think we saw a ton of Elliott Washington, Zion Tracy, King Mack on those coverage units last year. So that's an avenue. I think Vavu Torre is someone who was on that team white in the spring, and I thought looked good in the spring game. Where does he factor in? I think it's kind of the thing with what Cooper Cousins is the big outlier, but like you say, the further you get from the ball, it's probably a little bit easier to contribute early. You think about those 4 freshman defensive tackles, I wouldn't count on any of those guys burning that red shirt based on development and then what's ahead of them.
Yeah.
But I think that we'll see a good amount of those guys. I think that the way that Penn State recruited for the class of 2024 and some of there aren't really holes on this roster, but I guess where the opportunities are on the roster, I think it lines up pretty well when you think about someone like a Tysier Denmark in the wide receiver group. So I think we'll see a decent amount of them. I'm interested in how those red shirts are rationed, but we'll see that travel roster. We'll see who's on the opening kickoff coverage team at West Virginia. And I think that'll give us really good insight off the bat on where these freshmen stand.
And of course, you're balancing this with a pretty impressive transfer class in terms of what we expected for on-field output and guys at cornerback. And I know they're high on this trio of freshmen and Kenny Wosley and Antoine Belgrave-Schroeder and John Mitchell. But when you add A.J. Harris and Jalen Kimber, that complicates the situation. All sorts of different paths. And I just want to remind people, just because a guy doesn't show up as a freshman on August 31st doesn't mean he can't be a factor later. Drew Shelton, where was he for most of 2022? He ends up being your starting left tackle for the final 5 games, including the Rose Bowl, because of what you needed from him to step up. So this freshman class will remain in our attention, more on the peripheral now that we get into the season. But some guys we do expect to be on the field early and often as the season comes. I want to give a little intel on a redshirt freshman, Dakari Nelson. We mentioned with Tyler Calvaruso last episode, we looked back a little bit about kind of the versatility of his recruitment process, a guy that we knew could eventually be a factor at the second level. He did move from safety to linebacker. James Franklin really talked largely about this being a move dictated by Mother Nature. He said the genetics were kind of telling Dakari that it was time to move. He said he was at 220 pounds just about and fighting it. They don't want guys fighting to stay at weights. He talked a little bit about Abdul Carter trying to fight to stay at 250 pounds at linebacker. Now he's about 260 playing defensive end. So Nelson goes from being a big body in the defensive back field to being a big body at linebacker. I don't think there's anybody aside from Tamir Robinson when we looked at practice that really has his length at linebacker. And when you look at his frame, 6'3", 217 pounds is where he listed. I mean, it's right up there with anybody in that linebacker room right now. And he was working in the back of the pack there, and you'd understand that making the transition. But Tony Rojas talked about the tools that he has given some of those linebackers, and from his experience of covering a lot of tight ends at the safety position, he's been able to give some advice on inside, outside leverage, a downfield defensive back coverage kind of technique. And he's also learning a lot about what it's like to stick your face in it as a linebacker. And we've heard good things about how he's responded to that physically, his aggression. And so I don't know necessarily how this shows up defensively for Penn State, especially early in the season. But I know hearing from Tom Allen, hearing from James Franklin and Justin Lustig on Tuesday, and then Tony Ross a bit, I'm really sold on what they may be seeing from Dakari Nelson. I mean, let's not forget, he's a top 200 recruit from Selma, Alabama, a guy who was a wanted man in SEC territory. Auburn would have loved to have kept him home. He was a big win for Penn State on the recruiting trail. And so I think we have to kind of you have to shift focus, because you're talking about a top 24/7 player who in year 2 we're not saying is going to play a bunch, but I think special teams is going to be a factor for him. And I think ultimately, let's see November what that 2-3 deep looks like at linebacker and how he's worked his way there. We just have to kind of be aware of what the expectations really are right now for Nelson, considering his newness at linebacker, a mid-camp swish. And by the way, the staff raved about his willingness to do this. A lot of guys would maybe push back or be uncomfortable. It sounds like he's really made that transition. He's fired up about it. The staff is. And so just something to file away in a developmental aspect for this team. Mark, Andy Kotelnicki was back at the microphone for us on Tuesday after practice. We'll take him every time we can get him. Fortunately, that was the 3rd time in the month of August. We're appreciative for that. But you were there with Brendan Cam, and I'm curious what stood out to you about Kotelnicki's latest run-in with us. I know a variety of questions were thrown his way. Anything that you feel like would be worthwhile in passing along to our listeners and viewers?
No, I'd just like to talk about him in a broader perspective, because I think sometimes we try to look at like one press conference, but the body of work, what we've seen from him through the spring and then through camp. I mean, just the way he carries himself out on that field, making up goofy nicknames for players, putting on a boxing glove and getting in the middle of a drill to break it up, flipping off one of his players jokingly in the middle of a play. I mean, I'm just telling you, I mean, that stuff may sound goofy. The day when he was out there with the cutoff shirt, when all the offensive coaches were wearing suns out, guns out shirts, and he's like in the middle of it flexing for our camera, that may seem silly, but when you compare it to the former offensive coordinator, Mike Yurcich, he just seems like he's having a blast out there, and the players seem like they're having a blast playing for him. And then the other thing is, I don't know if you guys are picking it up, but Drew Aller, to me, is doing such a better job of explaining stuff to us about what they're doing. It's almost as if you can see that he really has grasped this maybe better than whatever was being taught to him before. And the one quote that it kind of jumped out to me, and I wanted to just say it, and it's nothing tremendous, but I think we do a really good job of getting our best players the ball in space and creating distortion, which is what Coach K's philosophy is all about. I mean, that's Drew Aller in a nutshell, saying what all this complicated offense is about. And it's one thing for Andy Kotelnicki, and if you ever have the opportunity to talk to him, he is very good at explaining complex things in ways that dopes like me can understand it. And if you don't understand it and you say, hey, can you, explain that, then he'll do it. Tom Allen's the same way, just with a different personality. And I just think what you're seeing from Drew and what you're hearing from Drew, part of that is probably his natural development as a young guy. But I also think he just has a better grasp of things. That's another thing. I keep saying it over and over. I am so anxious to see what Drew Aller is all about. And I think that's going to tell us what Andy Kotelnicki is all about in that opener against West Virginia. I mean, I'm just really anxious to see it. But I know we're out there on the field, and I sent you guys a text, and I'm not going to say what the play was. But, Drew Aller said, it's the hardest thing for me, the whole offensive play, for the players to adjust to, is the verbiage, because the plays do get a little wordy in terms of length of the play. And we heard that at practice, and it's like, blah, 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 all these words, I think it was 18 words or something, rattling them off. But at this point, you could tell that Drew Aller is comfortable with it. So, yeah, I mean, we could talk about interviewing Andy Kotelnicki, but I think kind of seeing the results. The other thing, when I'm thinking about that, you go back to when you see these interviews with NFL quarterback prospects when they're at the combine and they're sitting down, whether it's on Hard Knocks or whatever, and they're sitting down with offensive coordinators or head coaches and drawing stuff on the board or saying what plays are. And you hear Drew Aller, and that's like, wow, this sounds like an NFL quarterback barking out a play. And so to me, that may not seem like a whole heck of a lot, but I think the fact that Aller is clearly absorbing this speaks a lot to what Andy Kotelnicki has done. But again, let's see how it works when they get out there on the field at WVU.
From a personality standpoint, Kotelnicki has been exactly as advertised. I'll send some love in the direction to our Kansas reporters in the network, because they gave us kind of the scouting report on this guy, and they nailed it. They were on the money. Major change of pace in terms of what we're dealing with from a media perspective at the offensive coordinator position. And I certainly am getting the sense that it's a major change of pace within team facilities in the offensive meeting room as well. Daniel, you did a lot of the heavy lifting for us, working our way through the transcription from Kotelnicki's latest appearance. Was there anything specific? And I do appreciate the direction that Mark took that, because I think it's something that a lot of fans out there maybe not picking up from afar, but anything specific that you felt like was worth applying to this episode?
I liked how he compared the play calls to Legos in terms of stacking everything together, and it all fits together and creates.
Again, explaining it so a dope
bigger.
like me could understand it. Mark, go back and pick up your Lego set, and this is how it works.
Yeah, and I think that dovetails too with what when I asked Drew Aller last week about Luke Reynolds, and he was talking about how, in terms of those tags in the play call, that a lot of those apply to the tight ends and apply to the tight ends in different situations. And to hear what we heard, and then hear that a freshman who got here in January and is learning a whole new position. Obviously, Reynolds' quarterback background probably helps a little bit there, but to hear that a freshman coming in is really embracing that and is in tune with it, I think that's probably a credit to how Kotelnicki is teaching things to this group. One thing he said about Drew Aller was that he talked about you see someone from afar and you don't really get that into it because you're focused on your own stuff at a different school. I think he said you just see the Sports Center highlights of guys at other places. But he said that getting here and working with Aller's decision making has stood out to him. He also highlighted Aller's want to get better and to grow. I think that is, especially after how we saw last year go for Drew Aller, to know that he has that kind of approach and that want to and willingness to really build on what he did last year and maybe clean up some of the things that didn't go as well. I think that stands out to me as well. But I thought Mark did a really good job of summarizing what we heard from Kotelnicki and how he's presenting himself to us and how we're seeing him come across both on the field with his players and in these media situations.
Yeah, one other thing, Tyler, and yeah, as Daniel was going through that, I remembered one quote, and somebody asked him about a quarterback kind of understanding the game and seeing things, because that's what he's talking about Aller has. And Kotelnicki said, that's why NFL quarterbacks get paid like $1 bazillion, you know? So, I mean, he obviously thinks very highly of Drew Aller. And I know I keep saying it, but I just want to see this whole package out on the field, because I have a feeling that it's going to work. I have a feeling that this is going to come together, but we're not going to know until they get out there. So I'm so anxious to see this and see if they're actually able to do the stuff that they're talking about.
Yeah, and I want to know how Bo Prabula fits in, because apparently Andy Kotelnicki thinks he fits in, and I'm really curious to see what that looks like. Shifting gears, I dove into Tom Allen's audio on our site this week. And if you've been following our live updates at lions247.com, we appreciate you. But this, I think after hearing from Tom Allen earlier this August, I talked about on the podcast how he is personally just really enjoying a reset for himself, going from the CEO who has to deal with NIL and transfer portal and everything when you're managing a staff and an entire roster, to now being a defensive coordinator and a linebackers coach who can shut himself in his office and review film. And Mark, you wrote a great piece about his ability to now evaluate film and how much that matters to him. And it's kind of his little quiet, special space in the world of football that was kind of taken away from him a little bit as the head coach at Indiana. But this time I'm going to go more down the line of Tom Allen looking around what he has and taking stock of it, and really sinking in that he's never had an arsenal like this as a coach. With what he has right now and the blue chip talent he has as a coach, he talked about those dynamic defensive ends, the bookends we expect to see out there a bunch, and denied Dennis Sutton and Abdul Carter, and how much of an advantage it is to have one of those guys. He said when you have two, all of a sudden the offense can't say, well, we're shifting pass protection to this side, we'll be okay. They've got to make a decision. They have to kind of pick their poison. And I mean, just hearing from everybody on this that's been on the practice field in the month of August, it really sounds like this Abdul Carter and Dennis Sutton combination is going to be just as good as you think it might. I mean, it's really exciting stuff when we're talking about moving on from Adiza Isaac and Chop Robinson. And not only is there zero discussion of there being a fall off in the starting spot at that position, but people think that they can build off what those two accomplished last year with their roles here in 2024. The other thing I'll get to is defensive tackle. Tom Allen said, it's the first time in his coaching career that he feels like he can really work legitimately with at least 5 defensive tackles on a game-to-game basis. And we knew there was going to be at least 4 that were going to punch their ticket, be part of the conversation as long as they avoided injury this preseason. You've got the returning starters in Devon J. Thomas, Zane Durant, Hakeem Beamon was your starter for the first half of last season, and then Keziah Izzard has played a ton of Big Ten football. The 5th name that has popped up over and over and over again, and with more emphasis each time, is Alonzo Ford. And to his credit, he came to campus last year, got a week of practice work, and then was sidelined all the way until this August after making his move from Old Dominion. And yet he showed up on the field playing about 30 pounds heavier than he really has for any prolonged period in his football career. And he has been a resounding surprise in a very good way. We heard James Franklin use the term pleasant surprise. That's exactly how Tom Allen described him on Tuesday as well. And he says they're going to need all those guys and more at defensive tackle. He actually referenced what you did, Mark. He says when you talk about the potential length of this season and the nature of that position on the interior of the trenches, the attrition that can occur, he says we need those 5 and probably more. And so when you look beyond, you're talking about Caleb Artis, Ty Blanding, they've been around for a bit. You got 4 freshmen. I don't know what to expect from there. Xavier Gilliam's really the one that's come up in conversation. And then looking over at linebacker, he just feels like with Dom DeLuca, Kobe King, and Tony Rojas, that's a trio that he can count on in a significant way. Not just count on to execute the game plan, but to go chase after ball carriers with elite athleticism. I mean, he like everybody else, thinks Tony Rojas can be a superstar and can get there in a pretty big hurry. And like everybody else, he thinks that Kobe King, it can be a linchpin for this defense as a team captain, as a second-year starter at the Mike linebacker. And like everybody else, he respects the hell out of Dom DeLuca. He actually referenced Dom DeLuca and Tamir Robinson, a really intriguing redshirt freshman linebacker, as 2 guys he could see playing all 3 positions, the Sam, the Will, the Mike. And the caveat here is how much will we see 3 linebackers out there together? We talked about a lot, the 4-2-5 with the line position, a safety, maybe a cornerback coming, a linebacker off the field. But I know when we see those 3 linebackers, it really does sound like it's going to be DeLuca, King, and Rojas leading the way. But there are other pieces in the mix, and specifically Tamir Robinson is somebody that I was very intrigued by the feedback from Tom Allen finishing camp. And James Franklin noted he had an illness during camp, missed some time, lost some weight, but really finished camp kind of where he started it, as an ascending figure. And they need him at linebacker right now without Keon Wiley, without Kavion Keys. Those were names that we thought were going to be important, 2 deep kind of components. They're not in the picture at the moment. So just a few things there from Tom Allen. We have more over at Lions247.com, but I thought it was just interesting to hear him talk about the front 7 in particular and all the pieces and components and talent, and just knowing that he loved those players in Indiana, but he couldn't get those kind of guys to Bloomington like he has right now in Happy Valley. And that's got to be exciting for him. And Daniel, under the radar, certainly compared to Tom Allen and Andy Kotelnicki. Justin Lustig made the move from Vanderbilt as special teams coordinator. He's also coaching the outside linebackers and doing other work on the field for the defense. But you spoke with him, and that's an area where we know the punter is in good shape. Riley Thompson was named a team captain, but we're still trying to figure out what the place kicker spot looks like. We want to know what the return situation looks like. Anything to kind of throw our way here from your conversation with Lustig?
Yeah, Lustig wouldn't name a leader at kicker. I think some of the feedback we've gotten over the past couple of months had Ryan Barker and Sander Sahadak a little bit ahead of Chase Meyer, but Lustig wouldn't go one way or the other. He said that he wants to have it sorted out in the next few days. He said that on Tuesday, and today's Thursday. So I assume by next Tuesday when we see them again, we could know.
If he doesn't know by now, you got to be kidding me. Come on.
Hey, they have to look at all the data.
Last year, how much? I mean, Stacey Collins was the coordinator, but how much were they really convinced that Sanders Sahadak was their starting kicker going into game 1 if they came out of halftime and had someone else as their kicker?
But that's my point. It's like by this point, you've picked who your starting kicker is going to be. Now, what's going to happen if he goes out there and misses 2 field goals in the first half of under 40 yards or whatever it was? Then you're going to have to make a change. But by this point, he already knows. That's coach speak, which is fine. I don't care. It's gamesmanship, but don't tell us that you don't know. Just say that, yeah, we have a pretty good feel, but we're not going to say who it is at this point.
Yeah, so we'll see. He expects Riley Thompson to have a big year to get better, improve on what he did last year. He thinks Tyler Duzansky, the long snapper, has the potential to play at the next level. And then in the return game, didn't get too many names put out there, but he said he feels really good about Caden Saunders as a punt returner. He said that last year we saw Saunders could be reliable catching the ball. And then the one thing that we saw Daquan Hardy add to that was the explosiveness. Lustig said that they've seen some of that explosiveness from Saunders during fall camp. At kick returner, Nick Singleton looks like it'll still be the guy. They might pick their spots with him depending on if the team usually does touchbacks. They might keep Nick Singleton on the sideline. They might put him in situationally a little bit. But he did mention Cam Wallace, Omari Evans, and Quentin Martin as guys behind Nick Singleton who've embraced. And then I mentioned this a little bit earlier about DeJuan Lane being someone who stands out as a freshman, embracing special teams. The other two guys that Lustig mentioned were Quentin Martin, who I could see having a role back there given what we know about his skill set, and then Anthony Specca, the freshman linebacker. So that's kind of that's cliff notes of what we got from Lustig. I tried to hit on a couple spots and get as many names as possible from him.
Got a little more to say about Anthony Specca when we talk about that linebacker depth chart pretty soon here. But let's just quickly wrap on what we experienced over at Penn State team facilities and getting into some player conversations. I just wanted to mention a few things with Nittany Sutton. I'll give you the bold point. We have a bunch more at Lions247.com from that conversation. But the former 5-star, burned redshirt in 2022, started 3 games last year when Chop Robinson was unavailable. And although he is seemingly overshadowed by Abdul Carter on the national landscape, you will see Nittany Sutton's name show up in those first-round mock draft projections for 2025 already. He was actually, I was approaching him. He was on his phone on the practice field. I'm like, all right, well, he's checking his social media. Practice just got done. I get it. That's cool. Then I realized he was watching film. And I was like, is that film from like the practice that you just finished? He said, yeah. So we know they had a department. The video department does a great job. That's how quickly these guys have access to their practice film. And that's how locked in Nittany Sutton is right now. He was still, sweaty, still had the grass stains on him, and he's already reviewing film before he's got to talk with us dopes during a media session. So really appreciate the time from Denai and kind of the candid nature of that conversation. He said he wants to be the best defensive end in the country, not just the best defensive end on this defense, but in the nation. And he referenced a tweet. I don't know if he referenced or if I referenced it, but there was a tweet in 2022 that he posted before he even enrolled at Penn State. And it said, I will be the best defensive end in college football. And I had noted to Denai, I saw that you retweeted that, reposted it a few days ago here in August. Why did you do that? And he said it was kind of just to remind himself of the goal that he has in front of him. And he feels like it's achievable right now. He said there's been times where he's kind of had to fake it until you make it with his confidence. Maybe he wasn't the most confident, but he tried to project that and tried to kind of talk his way through it. He says he is truly believes he can go out there and be the best defensive end in college football. He says, yeah, there's also a little bit of competition with Abdul Carter. They've been workout partners since early in the year when Abdul Carter got relocated to defensive end. And he says they've really driven each other. And there's moments, whether it's on the practice field, he said it'll probably be in a game. He says, oh, Abdul just got a sack. I better go get a sack. And much like last year, I think you've got a situation where 2 guys could end up as all Big Ten caliber, high-level NFL draft prospects, maybe 2 first-round talents. And before they actually go hunting together, I thought it was just really, really cool to hear from Nittany Sutton about what that partnership has meant to him and the way it's kind of lifted up both of those guys. One other thing he mentioned here I was going to pass along, he's had 2 dreams about the West Virginia matchup so far. He said he's never had dreams about any games in the past, but he had some specific ones. The first one, he had a strip sack against West Virginia. The second one, he doesn't recall who the ball carrier was for the Mountaineers, but he knocked the ball loose, forced a fumble, and he said it was wild. They said it was a bit crazy, but this is a guy, I think it just kind of speaks to how much right now his subconscious, even when he's trying to sleep, is pushing these goals into his head. And he is about as motivated as I've heard from a Penn State player going into their upcoming season as I've heard on the beat. And I guess that's kind of just who Nittany Sutton is. Going back to high school, we've heard that he was going to be a pro. He was going to be one of the most accountable figures in the locker room. And he's really lived up to that for the most part. He's played a bunch of football, and now he's telling us all that the next step awaits for him. So we'll see. If there's a forced fumble from Nittany Sutton in West Virginia, remember where you heard it, and then we'll have to follow up with him and see if he has any other dreams or predictions coming up. So that's all we got. I actually have one more because we haven't talked about him enough. And he may be the offensive lineman who leaves the field as little as just about anybody that's Vega Ioane. Last year, he ended up playing a ton of football. He only started 5 games, but I think he had the 3rd most snaps by season's end out of any offensive lineman. And Daniel, I know you got to spend some time with him. You wrote some updates at our board. Before we dive into the depth chart, it certainly seems like he's secured his status to remain the first-team left guard going into the season. What did you hear from him? One of the biggest guys on this team, but relatively soft-spoken for being a 350-pounder.
Yeah, one thing that we heard from Drew Aller last week was that Ioane is taking a step forward in terms of being more vocal, making his voice being heard. And I asked Vanga about that, and he said that he's not a rah-rah guy, but if there's something that's going on and he feels he needs to say something, he'll step up and say it. And I think that stands out when you talk about this class of 2022 and where guys are in their careers. And I think Ioane is in a position to be a breakout player this year from that class. He talked a lot about learning the center position, and we've seen him snap to the quarterbacks, and he's someone who can provide depth there. He said that last year Phil Troutwine asked him if he'd ever snapped, and he said, no, I played left tackle for all of high school. And so they said that he's worked there. He said that he feels pretty good. He was pretty self-deprecating about it. He said that, if he comes in, they might miss a beat here or there because he's not Nick Dawkins, and Nick Dawkins is the guy, but he thinks he could do a pretty good job. He had another good story about Dawkins and his leadership and how he's making cohesion in that offensive line group. They said that before the first team meeting of the year, Dawkins told all of the offensive linemen to go to Walmart and buy black tank tops to wear to the team meeting. So the team meeting started, and it's all offensive linemen in black tank tops in one part of the room. Then he had another good anecdote about how Phil Troutwine is preparing these guys. He said that he was in a group of 5 guys going through walkthrough, and Troutwine pointed at them and told them to switch spots and continue doing the walkthrough. And Ioane said that they didn't miss a beat, that they knew where everyone was supposed to be. They knew how it was supposed to work. I think that's really interesting when you consider the amount of players that Penn State plans to rotate this year, and that if injuries do come up, which is how this works sometimes, that guys might have to be shifted around and be in different combinations. So I thought that was really interesting. The last point from Vanga is that he got asked the classic, how excited are you to hit somebody else finally when West Virginia, when you play West Virginia? And he seems pretty excited. He said that he's been waiting since the Ole Miss game. Y'all know what happened. I got to let some things out. So he seems very, very ready for what we'll get next Saturday. He seems ready to be out there on the field again. And I'm really interested to see what he can do. I know that we have some breakout picks for next week that we'll go over. And I considered him for my offensive breakout pick. I think that, like Tyler said, he's not going to leave the field very much. And with that frame and that athleticism, I think that he's someone you can really notice this year on the field.
I may go with Singleton.
I considered the breakout pick for Ioane too, but he got like 600 snaps last year. I know I'm gonna get flack for I picked Harrison Wallace for an offensive breakout. Sue me. He's got 1 career touchdown. We're gonna get into that next week, but it's a fun conversation behind the scenes here. We don't do all the talking just on the podcast, but you had a Ioane note too, Mark, that you wanted to tell.
Yeah, I got over there for a little bit. Daniel was doing a great job of interviewing Vanga, but I asked what he weighs now, and Dan, was it 340, 345 or 340?
He said he was still 340.
Yeah, 340. So I said, what's your body fat percentage? And he said 19%. So I looked it up, and the average NFL offensive lineman, their body fat is estimated between 18 and 30%. I would bet you that any of those 340 pounders, none of them are under 20%. I mean, this guy, you cannot appreciate how massive he is. I mean, he's like a brick wall. It's unbelievable. 19% may sound like a lot because, skill players may be 10, 11, 12 or whatever, or maybe even less. But for these offensive linemen, I would be willing to bet that there is not 1 or 2 offensive linemen in the NFL who weigh 340 who have a body fat percentage of less than 20%. It's unbelievable how massive this guy is. And so many times when you see guys this big, it's all heavyweight. It's all, fat, literally. And that's obviously not the case with this dude.
There was that camp last summer when James Franklin pulled Vanga aside and walked him over to a group of parents walking and asked them to guess how much Vanga weighed. And I think at that point they were listing him up over 350. And so he's just a very impressive physical presence out there.
I was going to say, James told us on signing day, and if you remember, he was the cherry on top for that recruiting class of 2022. He was a former Washington commit. He'll get a chance to actually face the Huskies in Happy Valley this year, but made the cross country trek. And you're like, how's this going to work out? And it's worked out tremendously. And one of the earliest things that James Franklin says is he was the best looking 340-pound specimen I've ever seen. And that was when he was a high school senior. And I just wanted to piggyback on something you said, Daniel, because you're talking about guys being ready to play multiple positions, and Venga Ioane is one where he could be at guard, maybe he needs to be at center. You've got Cooper Cousins, same deal, guard, center. JB Nelson, guard, tackle, and then just one more to add to that list because James Franklin brought it up. Javen Williams, who's been trying to push Drew Shelton for that left tackle position, has also been getting work at guard, and that's where he primarily played at Wyomissing High School when he was a 5-star recruit. So versatility really across this offensive line, and we know if they're going to go 8 deep by design game one, that's going to be really an important component. And let's get into our depth chart now. And I think we've already covered a lot of ground through a lot of these different position conversations, so we won't rehash a lot of it. At quarterback, you've got Drew Aller, Bo Prabula as the backup. We're really intrigued by what his role will look like. Third leading rusher for this team last year, 10 total touchdowns in a backup role. And then Ethan Grunkemeyer has an opportunity to hold on to that QB3 role for a while here with Jackson Smolik sidelined from a spring injury. Ethan Grunkemeyer has been loading up on reps on the practice field. It's good for him, and it's tough for Smolik, although we've heard he's handled that pretty well. But right now you're going into the season with 3 available scholarship quarterbacks. That's what the number was last year when Smolik was your third running back, or quarterback, I should say. And then at running back, as we just kind of laid out, that running back 3 job is right now in the hands of Cam Wallace. Not solidly, but it's there right now. And then you got Quentin Martin and Corey Smith, the 2 freshmen, kind of tailing a little bit behind. I thought it was interesting that James Franklin brought up Corey Smith and said that he's really made an impression because he's somebody that we figured would kind of be going from quite far behind the pack coming in the summer. So good to hear some feedback there. But let's talk receiver. That's the one that I'm sure a lot of people, when they clicked on our depth chart and scrolled down to find out what we thought about the receiver position. And Mark, let's focus on the 2 outside roles first. We're not going to call them wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2 because that's going to confuse people and think that we're putting them on some kind of pedestal. But we're just going to say these are the 2 outside positions. And Harrison Wallace, who we do think is wide receiver 1, filling one of those roles. The other spot we think is too close to call. Omari Evans, Julian Fleming, both of them have seemingly finished preseason camp on a positive note. They got a week of practice here. I think we're going to see both of them, and who we'll see first. That'll determine that starter. But maybe the guy who comes in second ends up with more snaps by the end of the game. It's one of those things. And I think when you look at who's behind those 4 or who's behind those 3 at the outside spots, Liam Clifford, one of the reasons we keep mentioning Liam Clifford is because he is the most legitimate option on this receiving core to start at slot and to start outside. Probably would have said that was Keandre Lambert-Smith in March. Then he left the program. Right now it's Liam Clifford. You could see him as a starter in the slot. You could see him lining up opposite of Harrison Wallace outside, depending on what they have cooking at wide receiver. And then you've got guys like Mekhi Flowers, Tyler Johnson, working on the outside. They came in a couple of years ago, haven't really been able to find their footing quite yet on the field. Mekhi Flowers shifted from safety. And then in the slot, guys, we've got Liam Clifford atop that right now, knowing that he could be playing outside. Caden Saunders below him. And again, Caden Saunders, what's his availability look like going into week 1? We'll see on Tuesday. Then we got Tyseer Denmark, Anthony Ivy right there. I just wanted to kind of give a lay of the land on kind of how we were projecting this early. Mark, from maybe start of preseason to the end of preseason, is there something that catches your eye about this group?
Yeah, I'm just anxious to see who besides that big 3 kind of, or big 4, I guess I should say, because you have Trey Wallace, you have Liam Clifford, you have Omari Evans and Julian Fleming. I mean, I think those guys have all pretty much established themselves. And I don't think it. I mean, James Franklin has said as much. So from everything we've seen and everything we've heard, you have those 4, but where's the depth going to come from? And that's why when you keep your ear to the ground, every little thing that you hear, I mean, or every little bit of intel, so when you hear that the Tyseer Denmark is kind of stepping it up, that kind of, you're like, okay, well, maybe this is one of the guys who's able to fit in there. I don't know that 4 is necessarily enough. I mean, so they're going to need a couple of those other players to step up, whether it's Denmark, whether it's Tyler Johnson, Mekhi Flowers. I mean, Ivy, a guy moving over from or Flowers moved over from safety, right? Or am I getting that wrong? Yeah,
You got that right. Yeah.
I've been confusing those two kids since they were recruited. But I mean, the key is somebody else stepping up and becoming, the fifth, sixth, seventh guys in that rotation, because invariably, again, knock on wood, they all stay healthy, but somebody's going to get banged up. Somebody may not produce. Something may happen. You're going to need other people to step up.
Yeah, they did lose Peter Gonzalez during the course of this preseason camp. We saw him out there on the practice field supporting his teammates, but not somebody we're expecting to see here early on in his freshman year. We hope he gets back to the field sooner rather than later. But, of course, going back to the spring, you had 3 veterans depart via the transfer portal, and Keandre Lambert-Smith, Malik McLean, and Malik Mega. And so, I think that they have said in the past it's important to get to 6 names. I don't think they're necessarily there right now, but the key here, Daniel, could be that they could probably get 4 names from that tight end room that are ready to go out and make an impact in the passing game. And going over to that spot, Tyler Warren, unquestionably the leader of the pack. But much like running back 3, the tight end 2 spot has been an area where it's been very important to pay attention to that, because Warren's going to move on after this year. So if someone's able to kind of take that role and run with it this year, they're going to be in a really good spot going into 2025. But just in terms of what we're going to see week 1, West Virginia, it's kind of got a wrench thrown into it, because Khalil Dinkins was sidelined for kind of an extended period here in August based on what we've gathered. James Franklin told us 9 days ago that Khalil Dinkins had been banged up, hadn't been available. We got on the practice field a week after Franklin's comments. He was not out there again with the tight ends. And so that would seemingly leave a really wide open door for Andrew Rappleyea, who we've talked about being the primary competitor for that second tight end job. Right now, we've got him with a bit of an edge, but we're applying the or between Dinkins and Rappleyea. And we've got 3 ors, though, that follow. And then this is where it gets interesting, Daniel. Luke Reynolds, Joey Schleifer, and Jerry Cross. The tight end room is highly competitive. I think this is a spot where we're applying these ors, but we're putting Luke Reynolds at the top of that ors list, because it does feel like, no disrespect to Jerry Cross and Joey Schleifer, we've just heard more things about Luke Reynolds turning heads versus, hearing that Cross has gotten bigger and Schleifer has gotten bigger. We have heard that Reynolds has gotten bigger, but we've heard a bit more. And we know he's the number 1 tight end recruit in the country coming to campus.
Tyler has respect for the touchdown king title when it comes to the depth chart. But yeah, I mean, I think that Rappleyea is in a position to be out there against West Virginia and be able to make an impact and establish himself as that next tight end after Tyler Warren. I think that it'll be worth monitoring Dinkins, and if we see him out there next week, I think that he's someone who will have a role in this offense. I think that he has that versatility to do the different things and line up in different spots, like we saw in the past that he did last year. But I do think that Reynolds, too, is someone that we have to factor in. I mean, James Franklin told us that Reynolds is going to play. It's just a question of how much, and it'll be interesting what situations that ends up being in. But I do think it's been pretty quiet on the Cross and Schlaffer front. I mean, both of those guys physically. I think that the quote that Ty Howell had is that Luke Reynolds walked into that room and saw everyone who was in there, including Jerry Cross and Schlaffer and Dinkins, Warren, Rappleyea, and said, I do have to get bigger. I do have to match the physiques that are in here. And he's gone ahead and done that pretty quickly too. So I think that Reynolds is in a good position to make a move. We'll see. I'm curious if it's 4, if they ration it out, or if it gets to the point where it's October and this red shirt is burned. He's off to the races, but it's going to be an interesting depth chart. I think that Tyler Warren is the guy. Everything after that, he can really shake it up, throw it out there, and I think he can look a lot of different ways.
Hey, when you look at Jerry Cross at 268 pounds, I mean, I think we also have to take into account that different players could be used in different situations, right? I mean, we saw it with Dinkins last year where they got him in a lot of goal line situations as a passing threat. But you have to imagine if they go jumbo with 3 tight ends, that a 268-pound Jerry Cross might look pretty good out there. So I think as we put these things down there, we're talking about, where guys may be in the overall flow of a game. But don't forget, there could be specialty situations where one guy may be a better fit than another guy. I think Tyler Warren's the guy who can do it all. And I think Rappleyea is number 2 in that regard. The guys who can be out there for every single play. But beyond that, I think they have great mix and match options. They've done a great job recruiting that position.
We've seen them go full seasons of starting 2 guys, and we'll see where wide receivers at. We know they like the tight end talent. You're going to see a lot of them, but if Dinkins is available and Rapplier is doing his thing and Tyler Warren is who we think he's going to be, man, it's just like, how do you get Luke Reynolds on the field, even if he is showing up in big ways in the practice field? It's a good problem to have right now, and it kind of it shows exactly what's going on in that tight end room lately in terms of the talent.
That was Rapp last year, wasn't it? I mean,
exactly.
Everything we heard about him was how great the guy was, and fortunately for Penn State, they were able to get through with redshirting him. So maybe that's the case with Reynolds, that you have him ready to go just in case, or you use those 4 games. But I mean, clearly, I think he's proven in camp that he's capable of playing as a true freshman. Whether they need him or not remains to be seen.
Let's work our way through the offensive line. We talked about a lot of this already, but at left tackle, we see Drew Shelton holding on to that job. He finished last season as the starting left tackle when Olu Fashanu opted out of the bowl game, missed spring ball with an injury. Javen Williams got a lot of work. We think he's the next man up there. We think he may get some game work by design as well, maybe at tackle, maybe at guard. And then JB Nelson is another name to know at left tackle. You're going to see him involved, like I said, at guard and tackle positions. At left guard, we again think it will be Venga Ioane. Finished the year last year as the starter there. JB Nelson was sidelined a couple different stretches last year. He was the opening day starter in 2023 at left guard, so he's going to remain a presence there. Alex Birchmeyer, a top 100 overall recruit in the 2023 class, we've got listed right now as a 3rd stringer at left guard. Over at center, as we've discussed, Nick Dawkins is going to be the lead guy there. Venga Ioane, maybe the plan B right now, and perhaps the heir apparent, though, is Cooper Cousins, who we could see push for work at guard or center against West Virginia. At right guard, Sal Wormley, he started the last 26 games there. We'll think he's going to log number 27 in a row against West Virginia, although he's, maybe you have to sweat it out a little bit this season with Cooper Cousins breathing down his neck. And working our way to right tackle, we've got an or designated there between Anthony Donko and Nolan Rucci. We're currently leaning toward Donko being the first team nod. He was the man who impressed in the second half of the Peach Bowl with Caden Wallace, watching from the sideline. Carried a lot of momentum through this year. They love a lot about what he's bringing physically and mentally that position. But also Nolan Rucci's come a long way since making his move from Wisconsin. He's a redshirt junior. I think we're going to see him by design involved. And something we heard this week from Denai Dennis Sutton was that the offense, and he was talking about how it's trickier to deal with than the past years here at Penn State. He talked about bringing in multiple or extra tackles and dealing with that. And, when you think about an extra tackle, certainly could be Nolan Rucci right now when they try to go with a 6-man front in certain scenarios. So, guys like Chim Diono, Garrett Sexton, Egan Boyer, those are developmental pieces at the tackle positions. You've got Donnie Harbor and Caleb Brewer, who are freshmen on the interior spots as well. You can go through our whole 4 or 5 deep across the entire depth chart at Lions247.com. But that's the lowdown on the offensive line. And then on the defensive line, which is, we can talk a little bit more about this group, Daniel, because I want to pick your brain on something. But defensive end, Denai Dennis Sutton and Abdul Carter are the 2 guys that we've discussed as being the leader of the pack. And then Smith Vilbert, Amin Vanover, veterans on this team. Vilbert hasn't played in a regular season game since 2021, but people are raving about his contributions in preseason camp. We think they're the number 2 defensive ends. And it gets interesting after that. Will it be Joseph Mpoye or Mason Robinson as year 2 guys, or does someone like Max Granville, freshman who showed up in late July from Texas, burst onto the scene and sees an opportunity? There's a lot of depth, young, unproven depth beyond those top 4 at defensive end. And then at tackle, we just talked about it. You can go 5 deep pretty confidently right now when you add Alonzo Ford to that conversation. And then can a Ty Blanding or a Caleb Artis make a move in their second and third years, respectively? Any of those freshman defensive tackles. There's a lot of names there, Daniel, a lot of proven commodities, and a lot of guys who are going to be gone from the program. I mean, there's no area on this roster when I project that's going to have as much of kind of a reset as the defensive line will next year because of who we think will leave. But when you go through all the pieces and parts, and there's only so many snaps, if you're Deion Barnes right now, and I know you're not, but if you are Deion Barnes, what are you kind of doing to make sure you're maximizing this group?
I think that you're, making sure that you're rotating, keeping guys fresh, and giving maybe some of these younger guys the chance to step up. We know that Denai Dennis Sutton and Abdul Carter are really, really good players, are potential first-round draft picks, but you not only need them to be fresh in the 4th quarter against West Virginia, You might need them to be fresh in the fourth quarter in December at Beaver Stadium. You might need them to be fresh in the fourth quarter beyond that. So I think if you're Deion Barnes, with some of the losses that you've had, to your depth in that room, I think that you need to figure out, okay, is Mason Robinson ready? Is Joseph Mupoye ready to contribute? How many snaps can those guys get to be that number 5 and number 6 in the rotation? When Zariah Fisher got hurt, we were kind of like, okay, they can still go 5 deep. But then after you lose Jamal Lyons, now you're down to 4 guys that you kind of know and that have played a lot. So I think that, can Jalen Harvey contribute? What can Jordan Mayer do? Max Granville? It's, can Zariah Fisher come back? I think that if you're Deion Barnes, you need to figure out how to keep those edge rushers fresh throughout this entire season, and to keep those guys healthy. At defensive tackle, I think you have the depth to that's not really a question. Just looking at how many names that you have on here and how long some of these guys have been around and what we think the potential or the ceiling is, I think is really, really impressive. But I think for me, looking at this, I think the edge rusher spot really stands out to me.
Yeah, and maybe it's a little more front loaded with the snaps than what we've seen in recent seasons. Last year, Chop Robinson and Adiza Isaac, they got pretty light workloads. I mean, not just in blowouts, but even in some of the closer games because of the rotational aspect. And could you see this team maybe lean a little more heavily on 2 projected first-round NFL draft picks and deny Dennis Sutton and Abdul Carter coming out the gates at least, especially as you're trying to get Smith Vilbert worked back into the live game action. And Amin Vanover is the guy that really seem to be excited about, and that's been dating back to the spring in terms of someone who can really step up for that defensive end unit. But he's got to be available. He missed, I think, 4 or 5 games last year with an injury. Over at linebacker, we talked about what we think the top 3 will look like with Dominic DeLuca. He was the understudy at Sam linebacker last year behind Curtis Jacobs. Now we think he's the lead guy there. Mike linebacker remains Kobe King, named a team captain. And at the will spot, Tony Rojas ready to step up. And we heard James Franklin say earlier this year he thinks his production will skyrocket. Beyond that group, Tamir Robinson, probably the name to know behind Rojas at the will spot. He could also contribute at Mike. But you've got Tyler Elsdon, which is, I know a lot of people, aren't fond. Like, he kind of is the guy that people have pointed to and say, why is Tyler Elsdon on the field? We don't like this on our message board. But Elsdon is somebody that has played a lot of football. And to have somebody like that as your backup, Mike, not just as someone who's going to get playing time, but as someone who's going to be a sounding board on the sidelines. And I think it's pretty important to have him, a former starter at Mike linebacker, as the backup there. And then at Sam, we think there's a move being made by Anthony Specca, the freshman linebacker who came to campus from Pittsburgh Central Catholic during the summer, physically really put himself in a good spot to reach preseason camp and go compete with older players and hold his own. And then mentally, he's been really sharp by many accounts and his ability to take and then interpret and then utilize everything he's hearing from Tom Allen, defensive coordinator and linebackers coach. So we think that Specca has an opportunity to maybe break through, crack that 2 deep. I think he can be a special teams component. So another name that we're kind of monitoring. We have not seen much of Kari Jackson lately, the other freshman linebacker. They only brought 2 on board. But again, this is a spot that's impacted by injuries and dismissals with Kavion Keys and Keon Wiley out of the mix. And the big thing here, though, Mark, is we just don't know when Abdul Carter, when number 11 is going to work his way back to linebacker, and it's going to be week by week, maybe a possession by possession kind of thing. Do you think this linebacker unit, beyond the top 3, is built to supply an elite level defense from game 1 through maybe game 17?
If they stay healthy, and if this defense ends up being the kind of working the way that we think it's going to work, where we see a lot of that line position, and maybe you're only playing with 2 linebackers. But, right now, I agree with you. I mean, I think it's unfair, the criticism that Tyler Elsdon takes. To me, this is another one of those guys who may not be a starter, but he's like another captain on that team, and he's an excellent insurance policy in case, Kobe King gets bumped up. To have him back there, I think, is excellent, and to give Kobe King a break, I think that's really good. If he had to be an every down player, maybe they have to make a move. That may just be the case because I just don't know that he has the athletic ability. But I think given what we saw in the blue-white game, given what we're hearing about this team, given what we've seen from Tom Allen defenses over the years, it's not going to be surprising to see a lot of that 4-2-5. And if that's the case, I think this linebacker unit is going to be just fine. I'm also, we mentioned it earlier. The first practice where we saw Dakari Nelson, he was kind of not in with the main groups, but I don't think they move him unless they intend to work him up there. I think it would have been unfair for them to throw him in with the first couple groups when he just moves to that position. But I would really keep an eye on Dakari because he's a guy, we were talking about him before. I remember the first time I saw him, it was at the Hershey Children's visit a couple years ago, or last year, not this year, but the previous year. I'm like, I was drawing a blank on who he was because I'm like, who's this linebacker? This kid is like gigantic. And he's got the size, he's got the athletic ability. It's going to be a matter of getting used to playing linebacker. So, we have him down there as a fourth teamer, but I could really see him being somebody who climbs up and gives them that depth that they need. And I think you hit on something earlier too. I think Tamir's availability to play anywhere could come into play again if there are injuries. I think he's a guy who can move over and play Mike for you. I think he can play all three of the positions. Not having Keon Wiley, he's a guy who I think we projected probably playing as a backup Mike linebacker. That's going to, that doesn't help. But I think overall, given the style of defense we think we're going to see and giving the flexibility of Abdul Carter, I think they're going to be okay.
Good note on Nelson. And I think just generally, if you go check out our depth chart, just realize we're trying to capture the picture of what it looks like for this game now, right now, the last week of August, not what it might look like when they go out to USC in mid-October, because it is week to week. And we will adjust it week to week. We'll come up with depth charts projected game by game basis. This is just a starting point for us. Over in the defensive backfield, and let's go with Lion first, because kind of jumping off from the linebacker, that's going to be impacted by the Lion role. Jalen Reed has been pointed to as the clear leader there for a while, but there's layers to this. There's going to be essentially what sounds like an early down Lion kind of role with Jalen, and then more of an obvious passing down Lion role. And Cam Miller has been the name that's come up most often from there. It sounds like it will come from the cornerback room. So we're considering Jalen Reed and Cam Miller kind of the top there, but Colin Dinkins, Tyrese Mills, both of them are in the safety room right now. They played a lot there in the blue-white game. They've continued to work there. And Dinkins is really the guy, the younger brother of Khalil Dinkins at tight end, joined the program as a walk-on. He told me this month he never saw himself as becoming a 4.4 kind of speed guy. He has become that at Penn State. He's got great length and size. He keeps showing up on the practice field. So a name to watch there at the line position and at safety. And, of course, we're trying to figure out at safety who the fourth guy will be, because we know Jalen Reed, Zakee Wheatley, and KJ Winston are the primary trio there. We expect to see, when it's a two safety set to maybe start a game, Reed and Winston. But, again, when Reed's up at the line position, and if that's, if we're going to see some of that standard 4-2-5 setting, then we're expecting to see Wheatley and Winston back deep, Reed stepping up near the linebackers. But beyond that group, not only do you have Colin Dinkins fighting, we've got him listed right now as a second teamer, but Tyrese Mills, the Lackawanna product, I just said he's going to play some Lion. He's bounced between linebacker and safety. Got Lamont Payne, who came from the cornerback room this past year. And then those two freshmen that we've heard a lot about. Daniel, you referenced DeJuan Lane, having a really strong preseason camp after coming in summer. He's got the size. Sounds like he's going to be a potential green light guy. I know Vabu Torre really set a lot of foundation for himself through spring ball, built on that. And so safety depth remains pretty damn impressive, as it has been under Anthony Poindexter. And at cornerback, you want to talk about impressive depth. We've heard from the position coach, Terry Smith, this group can be better and deeper than what they did in 2023. And that was a really, really strong cornerback unit. We've got right now a couple oars up top, which probably isn't that surprising for people who have been following our coverage of the cornerback room. We're not ready to declare a starter. The staff hasn't done that. We're not ready to do it. We got Cam Miller and AJ Harris as or starters on one side, and then on Davian Collins, who's been a breakout player all year long, year two after his Mississippi State transfer, as an or with Jalen Kimber, who just joined the program from Florida back in January. Beyond those four that we have designated as potential starters, the next tier is Elliott Washington, Zion Tracy. They burned red shirts last year as freshmen. If you didn't add a couple really talented transfer players, they're probably more in that conversation to start right now. And then you've got three more cornerbacks, the freshman class, and Antoine Belgrave-Shorter, John Mitchell, and then Kenny Wosley. So it feels like they have freshmen who in other secondaries would burn red shirt, and maybe in other Penn State secondaries would burn red shirt. But Daniel, when you talk about the abundance of talent at the very top of that cornerback room, what we're projecting for it, and then over at the safety unit, Terry Smith, Anthony Poindexter, what do you view as the keys to, again, maximizing what appears to be a bit of a luxurious position for them?
I think the keys are figuring out who the dudes are, who you want out there in the fourth quarter of a close game. I think that they have enough depth that they can rotate through, and we know that they won't be afraid to put young guys out there in key spots. I think back to the 2021 loss to Michigan when Michigan scored the long touchdown that won the game. Kalen King was out there as a true freshman, and that's on a team that had Joey Porter Jr. and Tariq Castro Fields, 2 draft picks out there. So these guys are going to play, and they're going to play in big spots. But I think that you want to know who you can put out there and really, really trust and really, really rely on in the biggest spots of the season. I think that's something that stands out to me. And I also think figuring out how to utilize the different skill sets. And I think we've heard a lot about that through the spring with which players were getting looks at the Lion. Early on, AJ Harris was someone that we heard was getting some reps there. Zion Tracy was somebody else. How can you move these guys around and use these different pieces in different positions to get those combinations on the field for different situations? This is a thing where once we get to West Virginia, the mechanics of this are going to be really interesting to see who comes on, who goes off in different situations. I know that we've talked about how when you talk about a 2 safety set that you think about Jalen Reed and KJ Winston being the 2 deep guys. But if you're a nickel and you bring in Cam Miller and put him in the slot, do you really want to take off Zachy Wheatley, who is regarded as one of the best ball hawks on this team? So how does all of this fit together? Who plays where and when? What these snap counts look like? I think that the secondary might be where it's the most interesting, because this is where you have maybe the most talent and the most guys who could play, but it's also a place on the field where you can play the most guys and you can rotate through, as opposed to like a quarterback or even a Mike linebacker. So I think that's going to be really interesting to see. And I think maybe the thing I'm most excited to see, or just most interested in learning at West Virginia.
Yeah, we'll have a lot to learn about this group. Fortunately, we're going to go from projecting a lot about Penn State to reporting and evaluating everything that we see for 60 minutes of game action in just 9 days. But let's finish here. It's been a marathon episode. I hope the listeners and viewers enjoy this one throughout the weekend. Maybe they take it in a couple different doses, but hopefully we're doing a good job of really setting up this first game week for you after a really busy few weeks of preseason coverage. I have a question for both of you, and we're going to begin with Daniel on this one. Which player, and we got about 90 of them listed on the step chart over at Lions247.com. Which of these guys, any position, would you point to and say, I think he ends up, we get into November, maybe late October, going to be in a much different spot in terms of that discussion?
We talked about him for a little bit already, but I think the arrow is really pointing up for Luke Reynolds. I think that it's tough to ignore what we've seen and what we've heard a little bit. And I think that, also doing this exercise and framing it as where Penn State's freshmen usually start on the depth chart, and where they start from the pecking order and everything they have to earn and how many people are in this room along with Luke Reynolds. I think that he does have the potential to go from being sixth when he comes in, or seventh, or however many are in there, to be in that third and fourth conversation by the time we get later on in the season.
Mark, same question posed to you. Who's the guy that you're looking at?
I think I already kind of answered it. I'd say Dakari Nelson. Again, I don't think they move him unless they think they see a spot for him. So it's going to be a learning process for him, but I think he's going to have the luxury. Once you get past that West Virginia game, you're going to have a couple of weeks and then a bye where things are a bye mixed in there, where you have time to kind of absorb things. And I think he's a guy who you may see kind of fitting in to that linebacker rotation, maybe on the back end of the season.
I'm going to go defense too, and I'm going to go with a freshman. Max Granville got to campus so late. I mean, like 3 days before preseason camp, he had no kind of ramp up into hitting the practice field all of a sudden and sharing it with 22-year-olds and all across the field. This is a guy who was supposed to be a high school senior right now. Remember, he reclassified late. We compared him a lot to Chop Robinson, Tyler Calvaruso and I, when we were evaluating his pickup earlier this summer. Now that he's a Penn State player, the guys who played alongside Chop Robinson are doing the same thing. Tonight, Dennis Sutton called him Chop 2.0 on Tuesday night. And it's just, no matter who you're checking in with, the twitchiness and the size has to figure itself out. That's going to come with being on a college campus longer and longer. But I think that he may give them something off the edge, maybe in a way that maybe a Jamel Lyons did last year, where it's just enough of a flash consistently on the practice field where you find ways to get him involved, maybe on a pass rushing situation, and games that you're able to get those guys breathers when you're looking down your depth chart and Deion Barnes is trying to decide which defensive ends go in. Is there a chance where Granville leapfrogs, those freshmen from last year, Mason Robinson and Joseph Okoye? Because if that's the case, then it's not really that far of a reach for Deion Barnes to say, get in there, Max, and go handle your business. So I think because of the early positive feedback we've gotten on him and his ability to really attack the passing pocket just naturally, it's something that he really came to campus with. That's something that's a trait that I think will be beneficial to Penn State if they call upon it, even if he's 10, 15, 20 pounds lighter than what he's going to ultimately settle into at a Nittany Lion. And I'm looking at October, November as him, maybe being a guy that kind of fills some kind of 15 to 20 snap per game role. But it's a long way to go for him, but that's kind of the fun nature of this. It's not necessarily a dart throw when we're doing this. I think they're educated picks, but right now these are guys that we've got as, fourth stringers on the depth chart that we think when this team's in the thick of Big Ten play could matter a lot more for the Nittany Lions. Guys, it's been fun. We appreciate it. I think this is a good way to wrap up. It's our third preseason camp together with Daniel and another successful one, I think, at Lions247.com. And it'll be our third season doing this together. And if you followed our coverage in season in years past, you know that we go with the 3-man look on a lot more frequent basis when we get into fall. So it'll be exciting to have you both on board. I think we could probably stay under an hour and a half in those episodes during the season, but thanks for
famous last words.
Yeah, right. Tyler, could I give a shout out to everybody who gave us feedback on the depth chart? I mean, we put a lot of thought into this. I mean, a lot of thought, maybe too much thought.
Definitely too much thought. Yeah.
We do it knowing that people care about it, right? That people are going to look at this and pick the thing apart. And we want you to do that. We want you to look at that and we want you to question us about why we pick that or pick this or pick that. But a lot of texts, a lot of talking to sources, a lot of watching, a lot of listening, a lot of those things goes into this. This is no small thing. That we don't take this lightly at all. So we put a lot of thought into doing it. And when we get the kind of feedback that we get, whether it's somebody saying, hey, thanks for doing that, or somebody saying, hey, why is this guy here? Or somebody saying, no, this guy should be there. Appreciate all of it. That's why we do these things, to get people talking and to get people into it.
You can review the entire depth chart over at Lions247.com. And again, we'll have a new one for you come game week number 2 when Kent State's going to be coming to Beaver Stadium, and we'll react accordingly. Mark, Daniel, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for hopping on board again.
Thanks, Tyler.
All right. Been a fun episode here in the Lions 24/7 podcast. We'll be back with more next week. We'll get into the nitty gritty on what the Mountaineers are going to represent as the first opponent on the schedule. We'll hear from a West Virginia insider about how that preseason camp went. And we'll eventually offer our predictions, not just for this matchup, but for the season, for offensive and defensive MVPs, and all sorts of conversations coming your way. In the meantime, we're back to work at Lions247.com. VIP subscribers can jump on board right now. Annual membership, 30% off access. So take advantage of that. We'll be on the practice field again early next week. Another look at the Nittany Lions, more conversations with James Franklin, players and coaches, all that content coming your way on the site and ultimately to this podcast as well. For now, stepping aside, I'm Tyler Donahue. Thanks as always for listening and watching to the Lions 24/7 podcast.